The winter of 2011 looked like it was going to be Apollo's season. Two fictional motion pictures getting released so soon after one another, and both giving their own alternative take on the moon landings. Except, it never really happened. Although Transformers 3 premiered on time, the Australian release date for Apollo 18 was moved to December 2011. But never could I find it in cinemas, and never did I see it advertised on the TV or even during the previews. I spoke to the staff at my local cinema. They didn't even have any record of it ever screening, and nor was there any release date set. It wasn't until late January 2012 that I discovered the film had been released direct-to-video in Australia. This is obviously a bad sign. Direct-to-video releases don't always have a glowing track record. As any space historian would know, the last 3 Apollo missions were cancelled in 1970. Those missions were Apollos 18, 19 and 20. The film's premise is that Apollo 18 was secretly sent to the moon's South Pole in 1974, and the crew were unable to return because they were killed by aliens. Prior to the film's release, the screenwriters had hyped about how it was made from leaked classified footage, and that they filmed none of it. This illusion is certainly played up throughout the movie, up until the credits, when it's revealed the lost astronauts are in fact actors. Even had the filmmakers maintained this facade, I still wouldn't have believed it. Totally taking the moon hoax out of the equation, Apollo 18 is littered with technical and historical inaccuracies that are by no means consistent with reality and are immediately obvious to anyone who's even modestly researched Apollo. Possibly the most obvious anomaly is the crew itself. During the 60s, the head of astronaut selection, Deke Slayton, set up a crew rotation system that decided who would be on the next mission. Each mission would have its set of prime crews and backup crews. Presuming their services were not required, the backups would become the prime crew 3 missions later. Say, for example, a crew would serve as a backup for mission 3. They would subsequently become the prime crew of mission 6. Using this rationale, it's not difficult to work out who would have flown Apollo 18. Richard Gordon, Vance Brand, and Jack Schmitt were assigned as the backups for Apollo 15, so therefore they would have flown Apollo 18. So how did Anderson, Walker, and Gray land themselves on this spot? Their names don't even appear in the list of astronauts ever to join NASA during this time. After Apollo 18 was cancelled, Schmitt replaced Joe Engle of Apollo 17, due to high demands from the scientific community to have at least one of their own walk on the moon. So had the cancellation of Apollo 18 been reversed, the crew would most likely have been Gordon, Brand, and Engle. The supposed lost footage comprises of clips from the Westinghouse camera, the lunar rover's ground control television camera, and the 16mm data acquisition camera. The major problem is that only the Westinghouse and the rover cameras were hooked up to the S-band antennas required to transmit the videos back to Earth. The 16mm reels were returned to Earth with the astronauts and viewed after recovery. If the Apollo 18 astronauts never returned to Earth, how did they get the 16mm reels? Right at the beginning of the film, we are told that the Apollo 18 Saturn V is used to launch an unmanned payload.
Well, I think the way it's being explained is they're using a Saturn V to launch a classified DoD payload, which is meant to be very large, very heavy, and apparently unmanned. Apparently.
Problem: there was only one unmanned Saturn V launch after Apollo 17. It was used to launch Skylab. Furthermore, Apollo 17 was the first and last night launch of a Saturn V. The stock footage kind of gives it away. Speaking of which, about half the movie is compiled together using stock footage from the actual Apollo missions, if you can use the words actual and Apollo in the same sentence, and the other half was staged by the producers. If you have access to the NASA archives, you'll find it so obvious when a clip from Apollos 11, 15, 17 or whatever pops up. I have to admit, it's a little fun to watch this film and play a Where's Wally game pointing out all the little pieces of stock footage. But the new footage they've added fluctuates from between really good and really horrible. Sometimes it looks indistinguishable from NASA's moonwalk videos, and there are the occasional recreations of memorable moments from the Apollo missions.
That looks like a Navy salute to me.
This shot of the 2 astronauts riding the lunar rover looks pretty good. And how about this shot, showing the astronaut inspect his damaged lunar rover? Filmed at a low frame rate, the playback looks very choppy, like this particular 16mm clip. Even some of the zero-gravity scenes are decent. But then you have scenes in which the filmmakers are obviously not even trying. Whereas most other Apollo dramatizations go to great lengths to try and recreate the illusion of lunar gravity, be they using wires or balloons or whatever, here, in many of the full body shots, it's obvious that the actors are just walking slowly. No effort whatsoever. And although often covered up with distortion and video artifacts, there are far too many dust clouds visible in these scenes. How many times do I have to say this? Use dry grey sand, that way you'll get dust arcs similar to those in the Apollo archives. As mentioned in my behind-the-scenes coverage, the Apollo 18 crew stumble across the body of a dead Soviet cosmonaut and his LK lander. The astronauts even refer to the vehicle by name.
The Russians have landed on the South Pole. We found that LK Proton lander. It didn't end well for the cosmonaut.
Now in 1974, there is no way the Americans could have known what it was called, because the Soviet manned moon program was one of the USSR's best-kept secrets, and only made public in 1991. Still, mention of the LK will hopefully encourage viewers to look it up and learn about what has become known as the real moon landing hoax. Hopefully, that will dispel the myth that it is impossible to keep conspiracies involving thousands of people under wraps. Unfortunately, like Dark of the Moon, Apollo 18 has its share of disinformation. It's not as bad or offensive as Michael Bay's pissing all over the dead astronauts and cosmonauts, but it's still ridiculous. Apollo 18 is often marketed with the slogan, "There's a reason why we are never going back to the moon." According to the film, the reason why is because the Soviet cosmonaut and the Apollo 18 crew were killed by, wait for it, rock spiders. Yep, the moon rocks sprouted legs and attacked. They really think we're idiots. Now to be fair, the film does offer some decent CGI, which I've not seen in a while, but the concept is so ludicrous that never for a minute do I believe these astronauts are in peril. And the film ends with this statement. Obviously, the film is implying that the rocks that have all gone missing were in fact little rock spiders that got up and walked off on their own. This is preposterous. Just for the record, NASA has given away hundreds of tiny samples to world leaders and former employees, and have also loaned many more samples to researchers, educators and museums. A lot of these samples have since gone missing or destroyed. One sample even turned out to be a piece of petrified wood. When I asked Buzz Aldrin about this, he suggested that the sample was switched. I have a few questions I would like to ask, if I may. Firstly, as I'm sure you might have read in the newspapers recently, a moon rock that was on display in a Dutch museum, which you, Neil, and Mike had given to the then ambassador to the Netherlands at the time, it turned out to be a piece of petrified wood. I was wondering, at the time, when you were in possession of this, were you aware that this was petrified wood, or were you also led to believe that it was a genuine moon rock?
Petrified wood. Well, that doesn't sound like that came from the moon. The samples that we, as best I can recall, that we distributed among world leaders in our 45-day around-the-world trip were encased in plastic lucite so that you could see the small amount of moon dust. Now, what happens to that display, once it is presented to somebody, is not the responsibility of the United States, and it certainly isn't the responsibility of the crew that gave it to them, and whether that got changed, substituted for something that then became valuable to someone else, and they substituted a piece of petrified wood. And that would be my more probable explanation for this. Now, who did that? We have no idea. But I'm sure the United States would not present to world leaders a piece of petrified wood claiming that it was a sample from the moon.
Okay, so you're telling me that you give these samples out to the people and someone swapped it around after you gave it to the world leader, probably.
Well, that's my best guess, but it's a guess. I have no information at all.
Okay. My second...
I know that I had a watch that I wore on the moon,
Buzz, I've got a question for you, actually.
an Omega watch,
If I may.
and it was missing. But it's considered stolen property, and if you have access to stolen property, you don't advertise it around until the right time you figure out how to dispose of it,
Okay.
because you'll be accused of stealing or harboring stolen property. It makes things kind of complicated.
Reading through some of these cases of stolen samples, there are examples that certainly sound accidental, like samples being posted to researchers that were stolen en route. But some of these thefts are just careless. For example, in 1986, a NASA educator left his van unattended for a while and got back to find it stolen. A case containing Apollo samples was in the back.
Where's the car, guys?
We should have made it easier for him and left the keys in the ignition.
I think I did, didn't I?
Then we have examples that can only be described as an inside job. In 2002, a couple of NASA interns arrived at Goddard Space Flight Center after hours, waved their IDs at the guard, snuck into the laboratory, and drove out with a safe containing the rocks, no questions asked. Are we to believe that all these thefts and disappearances are because these rocks were in fact little spiders? The rules this film sets up for these spiders' biology isn't even consistent with history. The gifts and loans were all tiny pieces that were chipped off larger specimens. This golf ball-sized piece on display at the Powerhouse Museum, for example, was chipped off from Big Muley. In the movie, we see the spider die when one of the astronauts takes a hammer to it.
Let's get it. God damn, you contaminated the entire ship!
Oh, but they can handle being chiseled into tiny subsamples for analysis or display purposes and escape at some later date. If the screenwriters wanted to tell a good story and offer a reason for no return trips, wouldn't a movie adaptation of James A. Michener's book have been better? In his fictional take on Apollo 18, 2 astronauts were killed by a solar flare. And in 2008, Dr. James Van Hoften and his committee released a report that stated that we could not get back to the moon until better ways of shielding the astronauts were developed. Science fiction has nothing on science fact. Overall, the film is much better than Transformers: Dark of the Moon, but that's not much of a compliment. There are certainly a lot of redeeming qualities, but it still loses points for its disinformation and inaccuracies.